At time, exactly. Excellent. So, as those of you who've been to a presentation by me before know, I tend to talk kind of quickly sometimes. So if I get going fast, you're like, well, what the heck just happened? Just wave and say, slow down. And I absolutely will, and we'll look a little sheepish, and then we'll re-say things. If you have any trouble hearing me, again, same thing, just get my attention and let me know. I'm pretty informal about stuff, so I want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying and that I'm able to communicate things in a way that make them accessible. So if I'm using terminology you don't get or I'm not loud enough, let me know. Go for it, sir.
Happy for the Red Raiders?
I actually went to Texas Tech way back in the day. All right, how'd you know that? Did I mention that before?
Well, I've been to your talk.
Oh, fair enough. Well, I know I've seen you before. I just didn't know I'd ever mentioned that bit before. All right, well, there we go. Things about me that I didn't know I said. All right, so let's talk about migration and immigration in general. I've got a quick outline so that you know where we're going to be going, and then we're going to dive into a bunch of different issues throughout our time today. So these are the major areas that I want to hit during the course of the discussion. We're going to start off with some definitions and terminology, which sounds boring, but is actually insanely important, because what category of people we're talking about when we try to make laws are radically different, right? Someone who is coming here because they're hoping to get a job and send money back to their family is very different from someone who is moving from one place to another because they're being targeted for religious persecution, right? And how we deal with those people are very different. So some of the definitions are going to be a place where we're going to start, and that informs a ton of what happens in terms of policy. Historical trends, we're going to look at the very short-term area to kind of get to your area and dodge what you were asking about, sadly, just because time is limited. We'll talk a little about what immigration to the United States has looked like most recently. In particular, here we'll look at trends in undocumented immigration or illegal immigration, depending on your terminology, and how those have changed over the last few decades and what policies and economic things have caused that to happen. Then we'll look at the legal immigration process. If people want to come here and follow all the laws to do it, how do they do that? What are their options? What does that look like practically speaking, and how has that changed? Then we'll look at folks who come here from in an undocumented or an illegal fashion. What are the various taxes they pay? What are the various benefits they consume? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on both sides about what exactly is involved in that, and it's a useful thing to clarify for when that discussion expands later. Finally, we'll take a look at some of the current controversies surrounding this issue, and those will look primarily at things on the southern border right now, though it's also going to deal with a little bit of things in terms of refugee status and asylum seekers as well. So that's generally where we're going to go. We got time at the end. I'm always happy to stick around a little longer. I budget more than I plan and more than I'm scheduled for this because I love talking with you folks about stuff. So if things pop up that you want to ask about, go ahead and throw questions at me as we go. I may defer some of those and say, hang on to that. We'll get to that in a little bit. That's not because I don't like you. It's just because I want to get through what we've got here and then answer the questions as best I can. At the very end, if there are any things that we didn't get to that we didn't mention at the beginning or that I asked you to remind me at the end about, remind me, and we'll make sure to get to those then. And that's in particular when I want to hear what you folks have to say. Given this information, I want to know what you think we should do. I'll tell you my stuff too, but I want to hear from you first. So, any questions before we dive in? Hooray! Definitions, everyone's favorite. Let's start off with the term migrant. This is the broadest and most general term that gets used in these discussions. A migrant is generally someone who is just moving from one place to another. This makes no distinction about whether they are doing that legally or illegally. It doesn't make any distinction about whether they're doing it to flee violence, whether they're doing it for economic opportunity, whether they're, in some cases, this can even include people who are trafficked or brought one place to another against their will. It's the broadest possible term to discuss all of the movement of people from one place to another, assuming that movement is semi-permanent, right? If I fly to London to go like see Big Ben and then fly back, I'm not a migrant, I'm visiting. But if you go someplace with the intention or with the likelihood of staying there for a prolonged period of time, migrant would apply. Cool? Sweet. Next, legal permanent resident, not citizen. There's a distinction, we'll get to that in a second. But a legal permanent resident, or LPR, because I get tired of typing this whole thing, so this is how people often refer to it. Welcome, come on in. A legal permanent resident is a non-citizen who has permission to be in the country, and in many cases, they have permission to work here as well. It's not exactly the same as green card holder. There's like 95% overlap between those two things, but for the sake of time, they're functionally equivalent. A green card, if people are familiar with that, that's the thing that gives you permission to work in the United States. Almost all legal permanent residents have green cards, though not all. Again, mostly overlap. Come on in, welcome. So, next one then is citizen. what does it mean to be a citizen? Well, we've got a general idea here, but the relevant question I wanted to get to is how does one become a citizen? And there's actually some discussion and debate about whether this should change, but right now, 2 ways to become a citizen. You can either be the child of a US citizen, regardless of where you're born, only one of your parents needs to be one, but if you're the child of a US citizen, you are automatically a US citizen. Or if you are born on US soil. In some cases, this actually includes embassy soil, because that's technically US territory. Born on US soil, regardless of the nationality of your parents, you are a US citizen, and that's been part of the Constitution since way back when we drafted it. There are people who argue that perhaps we should change that you should need to have US parents, or at least legal permanent residents as parents. So far, there has been no significant move to amend the Constitution to make that change, but that's where things stand for now. Next is undocumented versus illegal immigrant, and both of these terms get used, and I want to explain the difference between them, because to some degree it's an ideological choice in terms of how people align themselves and what term they use, but there is a technical difference that makes sense too, and it's worth looking at those. So an undocumented or an illegal immigrant is someone who enters or leaves a country without complying for the legal process to do so, right? There are a bunch of ways to get in. Come on, welcome. There are a bunch of ways to legally come into the country. If you don't do one of those, you fall under this category. Or if you are living in a country without having done any of that, you could fall into this category. Let's talk about the difference between the undocumented and the illegal identifier. To say someone is illegal, there are rhetorical concerns in that calling people illegals there are some arguments that sets a bad mind frame. I'm going to set that discussion aside because I think that's a deeper, more philosophical one and less immediately policy oriented. The big thing that I want to get to here is when we talk about things that are illegal, we are generally talking about criminal actions rather than a civil action. Just distinction between courts, right? Criminal court, civil court. Anyone give me what's the difference between those two? What happens in a criminal court? What happens in a civil court? Anybody know? What was that? Yeah, in a criminal court, you have the right to a trial by jury. You do not have that right necessarily in a civil court. Sometimes just a judge will do it. Small claims court is an example of civil court. If you sue someone, that is civil court. Criminal court has the ability to punish you and put you in jail and stuff. Civil court can fine you, and they can restrict your actions a little bit like restraining orders and stuff, but they can't throw you in jail. Make sense? So civil court is generally one citizen says somebody else did a bad thing, fix it, make them pay for it, make them stop it. Criminal court is generally the US government saying you broke the law on behalf of all of the people of the United States. We are going to prosecute you for that. The stakes are higher, but it also means the protections for people are higher. You have the right to an attorney. In criminal court, you do not always have that same right when it comes to civil court. So criminal versus civil. With me so far? There's one more court that most people don't think about but exists, and that's administrative court. It's sort of a broader term that encompasses a lot of different things. Immigration issues, technically, well, they're civil-ish. They fall under administrative courts, where you have an administrative or an immigration judge who adjudicates your case. You have no right to an attorney. You have no right to a jury. You have no right necessarily to see evidence against you. Your rights are tremendously curtailed. You also have, there are instances, and we'll get into this in a bit, in administrative courts, in particular in immigration courts, children will be brought in as a defendant unto themselves without right to representation. There are some people who have problems with this, and there are some nonprofit agencies who involve themselves in acting there. And I think most people, when they get into the details of it, might agree that maybe that's a practice that we should change. But the idea in general with administrative court is because the stakes are a lot lower, because we can't throw you in jail, we generally can't hit you with really big fines, because the stakes are lower, the protections are lower. But because immigration and deportation are things that an administrative court or an immigration court can do, the stakes are probably higher there than we may usually think about. So that creates some dissonance between the usual way these things break down and the practical way they break down. Now, here's the reason why this matters. Generally, if we talk about someone having done something illegal, we are talking about a criminal violation. There's a little bit of fuzziness, but that's usually what we indicate. If I speed, I am not an illegal driver. It would generally not be technically correct to say I am an illegal driver because I have sped at one point in time, or because I got a parking ticket, right? Those things, incidentally, are examples of non-criminal, in most cases non-civil. They are traffic court, another administrative court, same kind of thing. Stakes are lower, right? So the reason that some folks have an issue with this label, come on in. is that it suggests that these folks have committed a criminal violation when in many cases they may not have. That gets to this next thing. Simply being present in the United States without documentation is not a criminal act. It does not violate criminal law. This is something actually that got confirmed in 2010, US v. Arizona. If you remember the Arizona show me your papers thing, anyone familiar with this? There was a setup basically where Arizona had local law enforcement trying to enforce immigration law and being able to pull people over based on violations of immigration status or perceived violations. They saw someone, and if a police officer thought there was a reasonable chance that person might be here illegally, they were empowered to pull them over and potentially charge them. That was a big problem from a legal perspective because that's not a criminal issue, that's a different issue, and the police don't have jurisdiction over that kind of issue in that way. Come on in. No, you're welcome to grab a seat, or you're welcome to just walk. Fair enough. So, partially because of that and prior precedents, there's the argument that says calling folks illegal immigrants is inaccurate, and thus undocumented is the more neutral term that many folks propose. There are folks on the other side who say, nah, like you did an illegal thing, you broke the law, you came to the country illegally. Again, that gets into breaking a civil versus criminal thing. There is one catch though, and that's this. Crossing the border improperly, crossing the border improperly is a crime. So in a lot of cases, undocumented immigrants may also have committed a crime, but, and this is something I think is later on that we'll talk about half of the folks who are here without documentation did not illegally cross the border. They came here legally on a visa, as they got permission to come here for a certain amount of time, and then they stayed after their visa expired. They have not committed a criminal violation. So given that that's about half of the undocumented immigrants, as best we can tell, in the United States, to talk about all of them as illegal immigrants creates an accuracy issue in terms of the actual criminal status of what they've done. So,
What are they guilty of if they overstay their visa?
There, it's an immigration violation, again, the administrative court sort of thing. They can't get thrown in prison for that kind of thing. They can get deported, but that's an immigration penalty, not a criminal penalty. But there's a lot of confusion here because of the complexity, which is why I want to take a bit of time to sort it through. It's also, when I talk about the people in question here, I'm usually going to talk about them in terms of being undocumented folks. I wanted you all to know why I would use that terminology. It's not as much to push a particular agenda, it's because I think it's the most accurate terminology to describe the individuals in question. So, making sure we're on the same page. Any questions while we're here? Yeah?
Anyone born in the U.S., was that? I thought that was an amendment to the Constitution, not the original Constitution.
Yes, you're right, actually. That was part of Reconstruction era when we ended slavery. Thank you. I was thinking natural-born citizen running for president, which is in the original Constitution. Thank you. Good correction. Nice catch. Yeah, when we eliminated slavery, we were like, oh yeah, black people are people too, and they can be citizens. There was an amendment that said that. Anyone born in the United States is a citizen. Thank you very much. Good catch. So, and these are excellent questions. Well done. So, few other definitions to lock in. Refugee. This one's going to be super important, not only because it's in the title of the presentation, but a refugee is someone who's fleeing a country due to what's called a well-founded fear of persecution. That's a technical phrase that's used in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Refugees and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which the US is a signatory to, and also in US law. We codified it a couple times, most recently in 1980. They need to have a well-founded fear of persecution due to one of these 5 categories: race, membership in a particular social group, we'll talk about that in just a second, political opinion, religion, or nationality. So if any of those are the reason why you are in danger, you have the ability to become a refugee. Here's how that process works. You've got to apply for refugee status outside of the country you're traveling to. This is why refugees from Syria are one thing that we talk about more, and we talk about asylum seekers from Central America, even though, and we'll get to asylum in a second, even though the conditions for applying are generally the same. If you want to apply to be a refugee, if you're a refugee and you want to apply to be resettled someplace, here's what you do. You go to the UN. Usually you either get out of the country you're in, or you go to an embassy office of another country, or you in some way get in touch with the UN. And you say, I'm a refugee, help me out. The UN then conducts a background investigation to make sure that what you're saying is true. You're not like a convicted murderer somewhere, because we kind of want to know about that kind of thing. They do a background investigation, and then they decide, all right, we got a couple countries who are able to take refugees from this area. We're going to send you here. Go. They make that decision both based on availability in those countries. Also, if you have family connections in a country, they'll try to put you there. If you speak the language in a country, they'll try to put you there, that kind of thing. But the key is the refugee does not get to decide where they go. They apply. The UN then decides where they want to send them. The country the UN wants to send them to then does their own background check on the refugee. It's actually one of the most thorough vetting processes for anybody out there. Once that's concluded, then and only then does the refugee end up going to that country. Y'all with me so far? So part of what's important here is part of the discussion we get into about refugees sometimes, especially when we're talking about places like Syria, there's the argument that people who want to do harm to the United States could claim to be a refugee and might be able to use that process to come here. But practically speaking, it doesn't very often play out that way because they don't get to choose where they go, which makes it kind of hard to plan to go here. And second, the dual background checks both on the UN end and on the US end complicate that. Yeah?
Iraqi refugees that came here
Yeah.
didn't go through the UN.
We set up separate processes in some cases. So if the US has designed a special process for your country, because like in Iraq, because we were kind of the ones who bombed their country, we were like, yeah, we should probably help you get resettled. In particular, if they were people who assisted us in that, that's a separate program that we specifically designed. So that's a good clarification. But generally speaking, unless a country has designed a specific program to invite you to come in as a refugee and to do internal vetting, which is honestly pretty rare, you go to the UN and then they figure out a place to put you. So, good call. Yeah?
The other thing, this can take years, though.
Oh, yeah.
You can show up at UN and say, hey, we'll send it. No. It takes
Yeah.
years.
The background check the UN does usually takes close to a year to do. It depends if they're really overwhelmed, which they often are when there are major crises, because a couple million refugees is a lot of people to process. And then there's the separate background check on the other end, and like this process can take 2 to 5 years in a lot of cases, during which time people are stuck in refugee camps or wherever else they can be. This is a process that we could accelerate and streamline if more resources were devoted to providing foreign processing for these people. So to your question, Doug, in terms of solutions to some of these problems, there are a bunch of ways to deal with getting people where they need to go or where we do or do not want them to go. One way is to try to push them away from where we do want them. Another way is to facilitate them going where we want them by providing more staff and more infrastructure to make that possible. We have focused largely on the push them away, or at least push them where we want them thing, instead of pull them where we want them, which is just a different approach. So you got to apply for status, not in the country you're going to, but in the country that you are in or in another nearby country. But the key is you are not showing up at a country and applying to be a refugee. You apply before you get to wherever you end up going. UN decides where to send you. In the US, after you've been here for a year as a refugee, you can apply for legal permanent resident status and then get the right to work and whatnot. In some cases, we grant work permits to refugees earlier than that. That's kind of a case-by-case basis. The president, in consultation with Congress, every year says, this is the number of refugees we will accept this year. And that's something that is, it's changed a little over time. Back in the 80s, it hit a relative low of around 80,000 or so. It went up and it was around 100,000 for a while. President Trump has brought that number back down, cut it by about 70%. So that number is now 30,000, which is 70% down from when he took office. And part of that is an ideological decision, part of that is a political decision, but that's where it's standing now. Part of this also is we specify how many people we will take from different regions of the world, so from the Asia-Pacific region, from Africa, from Europe, etc. And in doing this cut, we held most other levels steady, but we drastically cut the number of people from Africa and the Middle East that we will accept. No rationale has publicly been made available for that, but that's the situation as it stands. Yeah?
What does in consultation with Congress?
It's one of those great phrases that in a time where we all obeyed norms a lot more, it would mean that they'll ask the relevant committees, be it the Intelligence Committee or the committees that deal with Health and Human Services or anything like that. What do you think is appropriate? What are your districts able to handle? Do you have a lot of people who are ready to take in folks? And then they'll make a decision. Nowadays, they just sort of do it. So, yeah. But in theory, Congress can offer input. There may, and here this actually is more detail than I have on hand, there may be requirements about reporting that info to Congress before the final draft goes out or something like that, but Congress doesn't have veto power over that decision or anything like that. So that gets us to asylum seekers, and this is what the US is dealing with most right now, because actually, to rewind for a second, on refugees, Our max level is 30,000 as of right now. We've taken about a third of that last year. We didn't allow more people than that, and the reason is because the bureaucratic process has multiplied significantly, and we've required, if you all remember the Muslim ban discussion, there were a number of different issues that I wanted to get to on the controversies end. That one actually ended up dropping off the list because there were others that are more recent that we'll spend time on. But part of that was also Trump shutting down all refugees coming in from Syria initially, and the court said that you didn't really have all rights to do that. They had to amend it a bunch. But part of what happened is they've stepped up the screening on refugees above the level it was at already, which was higher than any other folks trying to come to the country. We've increased that level to the point where it is very, very difficult, practically speaking, for people to come here within a decade or so. So at that point, it's really hard to do much of anything from it. So this is one of a number of issues where there are overt policy changes and then there are administrative policy changes, and this is more of the administrative end. If you look into the people involved in the administration and the different particular policies they want to pursue, Stephen Miller is one who is an advisor to President Trump, and he is very focused on immigration. He also has a fairly hard line on immigration, and that he would generally like less immigration, both legal and illegal. He'd like to decrease both of those significantly. And he's someone who is very good at work at the kind of behind the scenes tweaking administrative stuff to advance the agenda he thinks is best. So in this case, there's the official broad-scale change, and then there's the practical behind-the-scenes change, which, while it doesn't change the overall law on what is and is not acceptable, it increases the bureaucratic load to make it practically much more difficult. And that's something that gets a lot less attention because it's a lot less, wow kind of thing in terms of news, and something that's flying under the radar to a large degree, but is probably worth discussion because there may be very good reasons for doing that, and that's a discussion I think we deserve to have in the public sphere, and by and large we're not having that discussion right now. It's simply happening without a lot of attention. So to get to asylum seekers, same things as refugees in terms of well-founded fear of persecution, but you go to the country in question, and then you either at the border say, I want to apply for asylum, or you cross the border at any point and say, when they turn yourself in to the authorities and say, I'm applying for asylum. It's called defensive application for asylum. And both of those, both under international law and under US law, both of those are legal ways to request asylum. The government is not legally permitted to block either of them without changing the law. So that's sort of the status of where that is at now. Like I said, international and US law. There's also no cap on asylum seekers. The whole idea behind asylum, we'll get to you in 1 second, sir. The whole idea behind asylum, and this goes all the way back more than 2,000 years, to the idea that if you are being persecuted in your country and you are fleeing that persecution, other countries, as long as you're not committing criminal acts or anything or haven't, other countries should be willing to take you in and grant you sanctuary. If you Hunchback of Notre Dame, sanctuary! Okay, that was funnier in my head. The whole idea of sanctuary in churches and cathedrals is extended. That is the same tradition that the asylum tradition comes from. The church was the arbiter of it back in the day, before the Treaty of Westphalia and states becoming everything. But that's the same basic idea, and that's why we don't set limits. The other reason, I haven't forgotten you, don't worry. The other reason why we don't set caps is during World War II, there were a number of instances where we turned away boats of asylum seekers, from particularly Jewish asylum seekers from Germany, sent them back and they were exterminated. And the world and the US kind of went, oh, yeah, it was probably bad. How about we don't do that anymore? And so we changed the law, and now we theoretically don't. Go for it.
If you're coming from Nicaragua, you can't skip Mexico and say, well, I want to go to America, right? You have to.
No. You can request asylum any country you step foot into, but you're not required to request it any place you go.
If you're not being persecuted in Mexico, then you can stay there.
The issue twofold. One, you may be concerned that the same kinds of things are going to follow you there, right? So if, for example, I'm fleeing a gang that a gang tried to recruit my son. He said no, and they said, all right, we're coming by your house to kill you tomorrow to send a message to everybody else. They don't turn us down. I take my kid and I flee the country. But I know that gang still has power and influence in Mexico. So if I stop there, even if I request asylum, I'm not going to be safe. They're going to be able to come after me and they're probably still going to kill me. That becomes a pretty good reason to keep going and get to some place where you feel you can be protected. It'd be like saying that people who are fleeing Germany in World War II, they should stop in Austria and then they're fine. even though Austria got or is conquered. So one of the ideas of asylum is we err in favor of the person seeking protection instead of erring against them, just because the risks for them are potentially so high. At least that's the idea. Go for it.
Is there some kind of time limit on the word once?
Yes, you are one click ahead of me. Well done, sir. Excellent precognition. I need to channel that. You need to apply within 1 year of entering the country. And that's something that is a US specific law, not international law. We've clarified that. International law is a little fuzzier on that. But within 1 year of entering the country, you have to make your claim. You wait longer than that, can't make an asylum claim anymore. Last thing is you are eligible for legal permanent resident status a year after your application is approved. Not a year after you apply, but a year after it's approved. And that approval process oftentimes takes months or years. Part of the problem that we're running into now, we have a really big backlog because we don't have a lot of people who are set up to process asylum seekers because we didn't used to get all that many. But as things have deteriorated in the area called the Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, as things have deteriorated there and gang violence has become worse and more people are being hurt and killed there, more people are fleeing and requesting protection here, and we're not really equipped yet to deal with it just because based on how we've allocated our resources and how many people we've put into processing those folks as opposed to doing other things. Other thing that's relevant here is the Trump administration has narrowed the categories of available asylum seekers. 2 areas in particular. This is a decision that Jeff Sessions made while he was still Attorney General. Previously, victims of domestic violence, especially in a country that has a record of not protecting women against that, Nicaragua and Honduras are both ones that come into really sharp focus here. There, if you are being abused by your husband and you go to the police, there's a very good chance that they will not do much of anything to help you. And so those folks, previously we said, yeah, like if it looks like your husband is going to hurt or kill you, yeah, you can come and get sanctuary here. That policy has been eliminated. So those folks are no longer granted the right to asylum in the United States. Likewise, individuals targeted by gang violence are technically no longer eligible for asylum in the United States. The argument being, if you're targeted by gang violence, it means you're probably associated with gangs, which means we don't want you. But the logical issue there is most of the people who are fleeing the gangs are the people who didn't join up, not the people who did. Because if you did join up, you got protection there. Both of these things are currently in the process of being challenged in the courts, and that's a lot. You will actually see this phrase showing up a lot in a lot of the things we talk about, because a number of the things this administration has done are things that have not been done before, at least not done in the way that they are doing them. And so there are some legal questions about them. These policy changes are among those, because arguably these specifications may violate what the 1980 law said when it said any of those categories, which would include things like gender-based violence or social group association. Or choosing not to associate with a gang is the kind of thing that they were kind of thinking about when they wrote that. So let's go to the last set of definition things. TPS, temporary protected status. You don't hear as much about this. We did about 6 or 8 months ago, and then it kind of dropped off the radar. Generally, what TPS is if there's a massive earthquake, say in Haiti, as has happened, and people are like, holy crap, I need to get out of here or I'm going to die. The US, will, and other countries too, will say, all right, we're going to give you the chance to come here. The way that temporary protected status works is this. When you get here, you can get work authorization. We only allow so many people for temporary protected status. We'll say, all right, we can take X many people from this country because of this disaster. There's a sunset clause on that. There's a certain amount of time that you can stay, but generally speaking, we kind of extend that indefinitely unless the country has recovered to the point where it is safe and realistic for you to go back, and the country can reasonably handle an influx of people returning without compromising the social systems they have there. So right now, there are about 300,000 people in the United States under temporary protected status, mostly from El Salvador and Haiti, as well as Honduras. And none of those countries have recovered from the various disasters that sent these people here, which is why that status has been continually extended. This gets to another thing that becomes an issue with the courts, where the Trump administration tried to end those protections. There's a California district court that put a hold on that. We do not know what will happen from there. And the main reason for the hold is, while it is possible to end this, like that possibility exists, the rationale that is supposed to be presented for ending it is that the country has improved to the point where those people can return. That's how this status was created, and that was the justification in the law. And the Trump administration has declined to provide that information, largely because the country's factually have not recovered in any meaningful way. And so the court decision is, unless you present that info, you can't end it, because that's the way it's supposed to go. The Trump administration says, no, we can end it whenever we want. That was just a suggestion, not an actual binding law, which has some lawyers perplexed. Second thing I want to talk about here are what are called the dreamers. This is a phrase that people have probably heard, but I want to make sure we know what it means. Actually, anyone got a definition for it? Or at least what they think we're generally talking about if we talk about this group? The dreamers. If I'm talking about immigration, I'm talking about a group called dreamers. Who am I talking about? Yeah, sorry, I got going a little fast there. I'm talking about a group called the dreamers. In the back, sir.
They were born in this country by legal, by non.
Almost. Because if you're born in the US, you're a citizen of the US, right? Definitionally. So not quite there. You're about 3 or 4 years ahead of where you need to be.
The parents are illegal and they come with the illegal parent.
Right. So if you are a minor, you're under the age of 18, usually for this it's under 16, but if you're not a legal adult and your parent brings you across the border, like you're not a legal adult, you don't have the legal ability to tell your parents no, like they are your guardian, they make decisions for you, that's how our law works. So you came here through no fault of your own. You did not choose to break any law. And since then, you have not committed a felony. Misdemeanor, that's arguably not as big a deal because those happen. But you have not committed any felony, then you fall under this category. It's a reference to something called the DREAM Act, which was written to focus on these people and say, these folks we should treat differently than some other people because their situation is different. Whereas we may be able to make the argument for a lot of other people that they did something wrong and that's why they shouldn't get access to good stuff or why they shouldn't get access to residency or citizenship. These people made no conscious decision to do anything wrong, and so it's not right to punish them by denying them that. And in particular, for a lot of these folks, if you were brought here as an infant, this is the only country you've ever known. English might be the only language you speak. So the idea of deporting you to a country that you have never been to and have no support structure in, that seems to some folks excessive or cruel. And so this is a debate that's being had. There's the support for extending some kind of protection to these folks is actually publicly really high. It's close to 80% of the American population believes that we should enable these people to remain in the US as legal permanent residents and that they should have a path to citizenship. Not automatic citizenship, but stuff they have to do, paying back taxes, that kind of thing, to eventually get to that. It's something that there was a big push for in Congress. There was actually a deal that was on the table. The Trump administration opposed it, and that ended up scuttling it. But this is another thing that I think perhaps under a different administration or with a different configuration in Congress has enough popular support to potentially pass. Right now it's mostly being used as a bargaining chip. This was most of the administration's perspective was people want this. In particular, the Democrats were generally more supportive of it than Republicans, but there's a majority support in both parties if you poll nationally on the issue. And they said the Democrats want this, we want to cut refugee numbers, cut asylum numbers, and deport other people. So in order for you to get this, you have to agree to the other things we want. The problem was everybody actually wanted this, and that meant nothing ended up happening. Go for it. DACA, same, almost. We'll get to DACA in a half second. DACA was sort of the workaround that the Obama administration did to kind of make this happen, which has some dubious legality to it, which we'll talk about. Go ahead.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Didn't the previous administration enact that?
Sort of. So this would have been a bill that would have said you can be here legally, you can work here legally, you can become a citizen eventually. DACA on the other, one second. Yeah, actually I didn't get DACA on here, so I'm glad y'all mentioned it. What DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It is the executive branch, not Congress. Remember, Congress can make laws, president can't. No matter how much the president wants to make laws, president doesn't get to make laws. Executive orders, they kind of verge in that territory, but it's a little sketchy. What Obama did here is said, all right, look, we have, and we'll get to this in just a few slides, we've got a little over 11 million undocumented people in the United States. We do not have the resources to deport them all immediately. Like, eventually we might get there.
How did you count that?
Great question. Hold that answer, because I've got a graph and the stuff from the Pew Center that got that information that I will get to on that, because it's hard to be exact on, but we can actually get pretty close with a couple different metrics. But that's the number that we're looking at. We do not have anywhere near the resources to deport all those people, so we have to prioritize. We have to make decisions about who we're going to focus on deporting. So here is Obama's direction to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. He said that, all right, here's the way it's going to work. Your top priority for deportation are people who have committed a crime, specifically a violent felony, while they're in the United States. Second priority for deportation, after we deal with all those people, which we probably never will because we have a lot more things to do than we have money and agents to do it. But if we deal with all those people, second priority is people who came here illegally, across the border illegally. Then, after we get through all of those people, then and only then will we act on people who came here as children. We are deferring any action on people who arrived as children, thus deferred action on childhood arrivals. So that's the legal argument for it, is what he's doing, what he did arguably was manage and alter, he just told the executive branch how to allocate its resources. He didn't actually make those people legal permanent residents. He didn't give them citizenship, but he made it so that they functionally would not be deported. That distinction makes sense? There are arguments that that is functionally an end run around Congress, that Congress should be the one making that decision. And there's some legitimacy to that argument. Like, this is on the edge of executive overreach, but there's a legitimate legal debate to be had there. He probably violated the spirit of what he was supposed to do, but he likely didn't violate the letter of what he is allowed to do, and thus the conflict. Trump tried to repeal DACA, and the court said, okay, you gotta have a reason though. Like, you can't, the proposed repeal was what was called arbitrary and capricious, in that there was no specific reasoning given for revoking that protection. And Trump himself had been on record multiple times saying they should absolutely stay. There is no good case for deporting these people. And then he passed an executive order to deport them, and the court said, you gotta have a reason, and you just said there's no reason, so no. And that's kind of where we are now. That's on hold, it's being appealed. Gods only know what will end up happening, but that's kind of where things are sort of in limbo for right now. So that gets us to the last term that I want to get to before we dive a little deeper, and that's sanctuary city. It's another one that I think people may have heard about, and I want to make sure we're clear on what's going on there. So actually, I'm curious, what are your folks' impressions when you hear this term? Because it has different connotations to different people. What do y'all think? Sanctuary city, what are they doing? Yeah.
The police in that city
Mhm.
will not pick up undocumented immigrants.
You're very close. That's a huge part of it.
Will not assist ICE in that.
Also a part of it. Yep, you're hitting the big points. Anybody else? Anything else under there that you can think of? Because you're about 95% of what's going on. There's one tweak that I'm going to make in there to clarify, but yeah, pretty much what a sanctuary city does is it says that immigration enforcement is the federal government's job, not the state's job. And the federal government has made that point a lot, saying, yeah, you don't get to mess with immigration stuff. That's ours. Stay the hell out. So the states have gone, okay, we're going to stay the hell out. How about that? The federal government's like, well, not when we don't want you to. Come on. And that's sort of where we are. So it's a city which refuses to involve local law enforcement in immigration proceedings or in interactions with immigrations and customs. One of the main ways that this manifests is if the police officer picks up somebody for drunk driving, right, and they're booking them at the police station, they can go through a database and check to see if that person is a legal resident of the United States or not. And actually, usually when these people get booked, someone gets flagged to ICE just as part of the system, part of the procedure. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they're the people who do the deportations. ICE can then say, all right, we want you to hold that person for the next 2 or 3 days until we can get somebody there to take them into custody and bring them to an immigration court to try to deport them. Problem is, legally, and this is the rationale a lot of cities have given, apart from the ideological thing, legally, the writ of habeas corpus and a couple other things prohibit them from holding someone without charge longer than that period of time, and longer than usually 24 hours. So they would at least be open to lawsuit with potentially very strong monetary damages if they did what ICE is asking them to do. So that has been the more neutral rationale that some cities have used. Other cities have made a more ideological stand saying, no, we don't think these people should be deported in the first place, so we're not going to help you do it. Different rationales, but they get to a similar conclusion. It's worth noting that sanctuary cities that term, that identifier does not necessarily mean the city does anything affirmatively. It doesn't mean they proactively let undocumented immigrants know about ICE raids. Some people totally do, but saying a city is a sanctuary city does not imply that that is a process the city necessarily engages in officially. Does that distinction make sense? It's more a passive thing. It's a declining to do a thing instead of actively doing a thing. And that's part of what also makes the legal question a little clearer for cities. The bigger question involved here is whether the federal government can then punish those cities for that decision, especially because the cities would be open to legal liability if they did what the federal government wants. So they can get sued if they do what the federal government wants, but the federal government's going to take away a bunch of their funding for their police if they don't. And a lot of cities have gone, no, you really can't do that. Like, there's law and stuff. And so that's kind of where they've run into a bit of a clash now. We do not know how that will be resolved. That's also something that's currently tied up in the courts. There was actually, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Does the city have to vote on becoming a sanctuary city? How does that?
Yeah, great question. Technically, no. Cities can do it however they want if they choose to. Usually what will happen is either the mayor or the city council will decide to tell their law enforcement, whoever's under their chain of command, here is what you are or are not instructed to do. They could have a citywide referendum if they wanted. It could be city council members who vote on that and then either get recalled or voted out of office if people don't like it. It could be a mayor who does that. It depends on the specific city's laws in terms of whether that would overstep a mayor's power level or not, because that changes city by city. So a bunch of ways to get there. Yeah, and then you next.
You said Trump announced somehow that he did not want to deport, I think it's the Dreamers or the DACA.
Yep, same group of people.
Later, and then later, he wanted that law revoked.
Yes, he actually did revoke it.
My question is, at what point was he president when he said, or was he a candidate?
He was president for both of those.
When he said, yeah, but what was he when he said, I won't deport?
He was president. He also said it as a candidate, but he was president. Yeah, he also said he would deport them as a candidate, so it gets a little tough. Yeah. And arguably, if he'd said one thing as a candidate and another as president, that would be a lot harder to use from a legal perspective because people change opinions once they come into office, and that's the realities of the job. So that would make it a harder case, but a number of those statements were also issued while he was president, which makes it a stronger case that there is no justifiable reason that's at least been presented or articulated to the courts in a meaningful way. Go for it, sir, and then to you.
It came out today that they were going to take the overcrowding of the asylum people and put them in sanctuaries.
Yes and no. It was an idea that was floated internally, and that Customs and Border Patrol said, no, you really don't get to do that. But it was something that came down from the White House. We don't know who within the White House. It may have been Trump, may have been Miller, may have been somebody else. Actually, I take that back. One of the articles I was reading about 2 hours ago suggests it was very likely Stephen Miller, and this lines up with a number of the kind of approach he tends to prefer. And yeah, the idea was in order to punish sanctuary cities or districts of Congress people who had voted against him, they had decided, or at least they were suggesting, when they have too many people in an asylum center and they need to release some folks, chartering a bus, putting people on a bus, busing them to a city that one of his opponents represents, and then releasing them there and making that city pay for and deal with them and house them. That idea, like I said, was shot down by Customs and Border Patrol, who said that they could not provide a legal justifiable foundation for expending additional resources to transport people when they could have just been released where they were. So that was the major legal issue, and then there was also sort of the PR issue and the kind of arguably ethical issue of that kind of retaliation. Those two questions were largely left unanswered. Where CPB pretty much stopped was, we can't justify spending government money to do this thing when we have an equally efficient option otherwise, so no. And also, there was legal liability for CPB if they put people on a bus and send the bus to San Francisco and the bus gets in an accident. Now, all of those people can sue Customs and Border Patrol because they didn't need to do that, and that lawsuit liability was one of the other things that shut down the proposal. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. We'll talk at the very end about some of the shakeups in DHS, because this, like I said, I rewrote this whole friggin' thing a couple days ago because so much has changed in the last few days with Department of Homeland Security. Let me get to you last, sir, and then I got to keep moving. Yeah.
Does the sanctuary city have to make a statement or publish the
Nope.
fact that they're a sanctuary city?
Nope. Some choose to, some choose not to.
Are we living in a sanctuary?
I don't know about Everett. Boston, I don't know about Everett or Chelmsford or Chelsea. Yeah, Chelmsford, I don't think so. But Cambridge, I think, has made a public statement about that. I think Boston has, but I'm not positive. Yep. Lawrence may have been, Somerville, yep. So they're city by city, and especially in this part of the country where cities sort of smash into one another, But yeah, it's something that is expanded over the last 3 or 4 years.
You
Actually,
don't have to
last
announce
2.
it. Word of mouth gets out there. And
Yep. The announcements are usually more of a political decision than anything else, rather than a practical decision. But yep. All right. So let's talk numbers, because so far we've covered a lot about both legal and illegal immigration and documented and undocumented people. I want to look a little bit at what the level of immigrants in the US are, particularly undocumented immigrants, because those are the ones that raise the most discussion and debate. And I'll get to your question about how they get these numbers in just a second. So first off, yearly, we permit 675,000 people to enter the United States as legal immigrants. That is the cap. Some things fudge that number, but like asylum seekers don't count toward that, but that's the cap on what we allow. For reference, that is 0.2% of the US population. Just this number also has not changed in a few decades. It does not update as the population grows. But that's how many people we allow in. There are a couple different ways that happens. First, there is a country limit. We will take no more than 7% of that number from any given country. This creates some interesting situations, whereby if you're trying to come here from Barbados, you got a pretty good chance, because we'll take up to I think it's like 23,000 if I did my math right, of this number. Actually, yeah, it's about, I can't do math. Around a quarter of a, yeah, it's around 23,000. Yeah, I did the math earlier. What's that? Is it 50? Where am I getting the 23 from? Oh, that's from one of the other numbers later. Thank you, someone who can do math. Huzzah. So, yeah, like 50,000 people will take from Barbados, or at least up to that many. Cool. And there may not be 50,000 people from Barbados who want to come here, so you don't have to really wait in line behind anybody. You just come, and then assuming you get processed, you're good, and pass the background checks and stuff. If you want to come here from Mexico, it's going to take a while, because if you want to come from Canada, actually, there's sometimes a delay there too. Our neighbor, both of our borders send people. But that number means that we functionally have quotas on different countries. It's not explicitly done that way, but it is functionally done that way, because there are definitely some countries where there are more people who would like to come here than others. There are extensive background checks as part of this legal application process. They oftentimes take more than a year to do. They look into criminal background, all kinds of things. In addition to that, the wait times will vary a lot depending on the country. So for some examples and context, Mexico, 22 years. You apply today, 22 years from now, statistically, is when your application will likely be approved, assuming you pass all the background checks and everything else. That makes it kind of hard to get here. Like, I want to get my kids someplace where they can be raised where gangs won't kill them. Well, there'll be a spry young 23-year-old by the time they get here. That'll make for a great preschool experience. So arguably, this is something that is a large factor in encouraging undocumented or illegal immigration to the United States, because it is not practical in some of these places to do it in a legal fashion, given the way we have things set up. Central America, you're looking at 10 to 13 years in terms of waiting. Again, fairly long amount of time, and during that time, you have to stay in whatever your home country is. You can't be here. The real interesting one, though, and that I was not familiar with until fairly recently, India. Yep, 151-year wait if you want to come to the United States from India on one of the different types of visas we'll talk about in a second, a work visa. If you want to come here as a highly skilled professional, like a computer programmer or something like that, that's what you're looking at. That's just the way we have it set up. And there are a fair number in terms of ways to solve things. One way to deal with this solution is eliminating the per country cap, or even adjusting it in some way, or adjusting up the total number of people we take. Any of those things would do it. But in terms of legal versus illegal immigration, one way a lot of folks will think about it is like pressure valve sort of thing. Like if there's enough of a drive for people to come here, they will likely find a way. There are a bunch of ways to change that. You can either make it more difficult for them to come. You can make where they are less bad, someplace they don't want to leave, or you can give them, you can redirect them to a better channel. But that requires opening that channel wider than it is right now. And that's one of the debates that we can have. Yeah?
The people from India are on like in a high-tech company. What kind of visa do they come?
Usually H-1B, which is a specific highly skilled worker visa, sometimes an L-1, which is a different kind of professional visa. It basically allows, well, actually you're about a slide and a half ahead of me on that one, but it allows companies to recruit high skilled workers if that's a skill that they're having trouble finding in the United States at market rate. So if you can hire someone here for the same price, you can't get an H-1B visa to hire someone from India. But if you can't hire anybody here at market rate price for that job, then you can make an application for those visas. They're usually like every year we release, I think it's, the numbers on the next slide, I didn't have it memorized, but we enable a certain number of those. They are gone in like 5 days every year because everybody snaps them up in a hurry. So let's get to the visa types, which is exactly where you were taking us. So first, two big ways. First is family reunification, then we'll talk about work type stuff. So this is another instance of a terminology difference. This latter term, chain migration, is a newer term. It's one that the more nationalist-oriented portions of Trump's coalition, and Miller as well, this is a term that he prefers. And it's a term that Trump has begun adopting. I want to talk a little about how these things work, because this is another instance where there's a lot of misinformation. Unfortunately, some of that is coming from the White House, and that gives it an air of legality or authenticity that does not match what the law actually says. So let's get into some details. Family reunification is officially the top priority of our immigration system. Our first goal is if one person came here legally, or one person is a citizen here, we want them to be able to have their immediate family with them. And reuniting families, we actually have a family first sort of setup. It's interesting that, set that aside. We have a family first sort of setup initially. So we have priority for immediate relatives. Now this is where things get a little confusing, because people seem, oh, I can bring my relatives, so here's what's going to happen. I am going to have my brother come, and then he's going to have his fiance come, and then his fiance is going to have her mom come, and then her mom is going to have her other daughter come, and that daughter is going to have her stepson come, and that stepson is going to have his second cousin thrice removed come, and we have 1 billion immigrants. That is not how it works. In particular, it is because it is the spouse of a citizen, not a legal permanent resident, of a citizen that is at the top of the list. A child who is under 21 of a citizen, or the parent of an adult child, who is a citizen. In the process of becoming a citizen, legal permanent resident first, then citizen, it takes quite a while, and it's not something that happens quickly or easily. The citizenship test that they have people take, we occasionally give it to high schoolers just to kind of give them a bit of a shock. Almost everybody fails it. Like, you need to know the name of all the different cabinet officials, you need to know the deputy undersecretary of this division, like, it's insane. People work their butts off for it, and it's something that I think it's important on both ends to end up respecting. So, you can bring immediate family of a citizen. Second, after that's done, we have a few visas that we leave over for siblings of citizens and for the spouses of minor children. So spouses and kids, rather, of legal permanent residents. So first, bunch of stuff to the citizens who would like that. Then we have a smaller number left over for legal permanent residents to bring folks. No provisions for aunts, uncles, cousins, brother's former roommate, if any of you have seen Spaceballs. I am your brother's father's cousin's former roommate. See, I try to tell that joke with my high school kids, and I get nothing because they've never heard of it. I guess maybe I'm missing on the other end of the age demographic. Anyway, that's the first one, or I'm not telling it well. So that's how family reunification works. The chain migration term is evoking that idea that one person brings another person, that next person brings another person, that next person brings another person, but that is not actually what the law allows. And that's why that's a term that I would suggest avoiding, because it, again, suggests something that is not accurate. Second major area that brings people here is the diversity visa lottery. Here we got about 55,000 of these, actually exactly 55,000 every year that are available. And these are available to people from countries that sent us the fewest number of people in prior years, or at least toward the bottom of the list. So if somebody from Barbados wants to come here, they got a good chance of getting one of these. So basically, everybody who would like to come here can throw their name in for this, and we pull 55,000 of them, do the background check, and then they get to come. That's the diversity visa lottery. There's an argument for getting rid of this and replacing it with either taking those visas and shifting them to work visas. That's one of the advocacies that Trump and his administration has mentioned. He wants to bring people here that have useful skills rather than people that will reunite families or that will enhance diversity, just because those goals, he argues, are less important than the economic goal. And there's an argument to be made for that. But that's one of the positions that's out there. This has been around for quite a while, though. Last visa types are employment visas. These are actually one of the smaller categories of visas, only a couple 100,000, but they end up making a big difference. So you've got temporary work visas. These do not count against that big number. Temporary work visas, this doesn't count against the 675,000. These are usually for seasonal employees. They are not immigrants who are going to stay here. They're people who come here, work for a few months, and then leave. Agricultural workers are an example. People during the beach season out on Cape Cod, like this was a big issue when these got cut back a little while ago. That's what these are intended for. Like I said, largely seasonal, and every year people have to reapply for one of those. You might get it, you might not. You have no permanent claim on it just because you got one last year. You won't necessarily get another one this year. The government decides how to allocate those, which businesses get access to them and which ones don't. That process is kind of opaque, but that's how they do it. Second category, and the one that's more relevant to immigration, are permanent visas. So these are people who are coming to the US to work and live and stay. The H-1B is the most common. This is for, at least the one we spend the most time talking about. These are highly skilled workers. So you need to have a specific skill set that is not widely found. The fact that I can flip burgers does not qualify me for an H-1B visa. The fact that I can create the robot that flips burgers may. Follow the distinction? So H-1Bs, tech companies are all over these things. It's a huge deal for them, and they fight it out every year. The Trump administration has been working to lower the number of visas that are allowed there overall. They haven't made a ton of progress on that, but that is a goal that they have. There's a secondary thing that goes along with that. I'm sorry, let me rewind one sec. So for people with an H-1B, they can get legal permanent resident status. So about 1,400 people who get H-1Bs are also eligible for legal permanent resident status after they've been here for a little while. And that extends to them and to their families. That's all included in this 1,400 number. 140,000, because I can math. Yeah, thank you. Go for it.
Who comes to the United States on an educational visa?
That's one of the other categories in here, because a lot of those educational visas are temporary visas technically. They don't allow you to stay. So this is one that I didn't have up on here just because I had to limit what we could cover in terms of time.
If they then get the highly skilled,
Yes.
become.
Then they could, right. So you can come here on a temporary visa for education. That lets you be here for like the 4 years while you do your schooling. And there are some versions of those that allow you to stay for up to 36 months and work in the US for that period of time, and then they expire. During that time, you would be applying for one of these other ones that could let you stay here permanently, hopefully. But again, if you're coming from a country where we don't allow a lot, where we're hitting the cap pretty soon, that may be harder to do.
The individual gets a financial incentive from their country to go to college and university in the United States.
They could.
They pay the tuition for them here in the United States.
And some countries do, but
For LPR, and we gave it to them. The country wants them back to do the job that they paid them to come
Yep.
and get educated. Right?
yep, that potentially happens.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, it totally does.
Here in Massachusetts.
Yep. It's not universal. Not all countries do that, but there are definitely, like China has a program like that. India has programs like that. Yeah, there are a number of, like one of the few things the US is really at the top of the game on economically, because we're falling behind in a couple different areas. Education, we are still pretty top up there. So like here and a few other places are where people want to go. And yeah, you're totally right. And so a lot of what we are theoretically trying to do is trying to make it so the country is appealing enough that those people want to stay after they've done their time, or at least want to come back after they go back home, do whatever they need to deal with the education, and then return. Yep. Last one that's relevant here, and this is connected to the H-1B, we have what are called H-4 visas. This is an issue just in the last few weeks that is coming back up again. There's another push to change this issue. What this does, so say let's do this more realistically. My wife, who is an attorney and is far smarter than me, obtains an H-1B visa to come here. I am the spouse. I'm like, I want to come too. Okay, fine. I get to come here as well. But I can't legally work unless I have an H-4 visa. Because remember, there's a difference between being able to be here and being able to work here. Often they're the same, but not always. So for spouses who come as the spouse of someone with an H-1B, they may get a variant of the H-1B that does not allow them to work. They need a sort of an amendment to that, basically, which is the H-4 visa, which says you have the ability to work here as well. You didn't have a high-tech skill that brought you here, but your spouse did, so you can come, and this visa enables you to work while you're here. They're currently, in the next 3 months, these will likely be eliminated. That's one of the pushes on the part of the Trump administration. That it's in review in Customs and Border Patrol division right now and in DHS. So keep an eye out for this. Some of the concerns about this issue is, for a lot of folks, there's a fairly compelling argument that suggests that when spouses are not able to work, in addition to some psychological stuff involved there, because it sometimes doesn't feel all that great to not be able to contribute, it oftentimes traps people in abusive relationships because they cannot provide financially for themselves at all, and that becomes one of the reasons why these visas are potentially relevant. That concern is not one that seems to have made its way into this discussion, but it is one that's worth thinking about potentially. Yeah.
Where did the 0.2 of population limit come?
That's not actually the limit, that's just the math. The limit is the straight up number.
Who set it at 0.2?
Well, they set it at 675,000. If that happens to currently be 0.2. Oh, sorry.
My question
Yeah.
is, where's the law that says 0.2 of the can get visas?
Congress, I think this is the 1980 Immigration Act, set that particular limit. And again, they didn't set it as a percentage of the population. So as the population grows, that percentage will continue to shrink. They set it as an absolute number.
Okay. So
Yeah, that was what I was trying to clarify there.
Thank you.
No problem. Good question. All right. So visas. Yay. So, sorry, any last questions on visas and whatnot while we're there? Because we're about to move over into the land of undocumented immigrants, because all of this has been documented legal immigration. All right. Yeah.
On that diversity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So countries that have a higher quality of living than we do, that wouldn't want to come here, would they be like solicited? We go after them?
Not that I know of.
Numbers must be way
Yeah.
low.
Well, and I think part of it there is there are enough people from enough places that do want to come that we usually don't have to seek out people to come. Like we got more beaten down the doors than we are able to take in some cases, or at least more than these current limits allow us to take is maybe a better way to do it. There are some instances, and this is with some of the other, there's a number of smaller categories like the H-1B that exist, so getting like professors or people with arts specialties, phenomenal artists. There's a specific visa category for people who have exceptional artistic or cultural skill that we'll try to recruit, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Suppose you get an H-4 visa,
Yeah.
and then you decide to separate or divorce. What happens to that visa?
Great question. I don't know. I'll be honest. I have not had the chance to look into that as much as I want to.
There was
I don't know.
a time when people were marrying GIs in order to come over.
Yeah. Yeah, I honestly do not know the answer to that. My guess, and this is a guess, is that you would not be able to continue to remain in the United States past a certain period of time. You may be able to then apply for something else or apply for legal permanent residence under another provision, but I don't believe that provision will continue to allow you to remain. So let's go to the undocumented area. So this is historically the trend. Go back to the 90s, huge increase leading up to the mid-2000s, then things sort of leveled off and have dipped and declined since then. In terms of how they get these numbers, and also the area in here in the early 90s, we didn't have as good information, so that's best guess. What we do, so have any of y'all worked for the census at any point? I did, and it was actually it was super boring, but really interesting in some ways. And so every time we take a census, we do not ever ask people, are you a citizen? That may change for the next census, and there are a bunch of implications about that change. But as of now, we do not ask about citizenship status. But we can ask, were you born here? And oftentimes we do. That information gives us some of the information that is relevant and how we get these numbers. They also factor in things like Border Patrol's estimates on numbers of crossings, percentage of intercept, that kind of thing. So there are a bunch of, and also actually for visa overstays, we can often we can tell this person had a visa for this long, but oh, interesting, it looks like they were at an airport like 2 years after that. Huh. So a bunch of different ways that get us there. It's still best guess. It's probably within 1 million or 2 of where it is. But there seems to be pretty strong consensus among folks who study the issue, both inside and outside of the government, that the number is pretty much in the ranges that we've got here. I was actually kind of surprised at how much consensus there was there, given how hard it is to determine. So this is pretty much what we're looking at. Few things that are worth noting. This period, huge economic boom in the US, which is part of that, but also lots and lots of drug violence in Mexico, which is a big part of that as well. There are actually a few things trend-wise that have made a huge difference. First, Okay, well, actually, sorry, I already got this. Current estimates put it about just under 11 million undocumented folks in the United States right now. About half of those are visa overstays, based on our information. So about half of the folks who are here in an undocumented fashion have not committed the crime of crossing the border illegally. Thus, they are not, in a technical sense, illegal immigrants. So, rhetorical difference, but can matter. This is the big deal. Who is coming here has changed significantly over the last decade. It used to be, during almost all of this trend, it was people coming to the United States largely from Mexico, usually single males who would come here to get cheap work and send money back to their families in Mexico. Like, that was usually what happened. Kids and families fleeing violence were about 3% of the folks who came here in 2013. It is now 40% of all the people who entered the United States this way. Massive change. And a lot of that is because of the explosion of gang violence and other types of violence in the Northern Triangle down in Central America. One part of that, too, El Salvador has had a lot of issues. One of the issues, MS-13 is a gang that you all expect may have heard about. The president talks about them a fair amount. They are scary and they do some really bad stuff. They actually largely began in a U.S. prison, and then we deported those gang members to El Salvador. They are now the gang that is largely running and terrorizing El Salvador. So while in the same way that some of our involvement in the Cold War created some of the problems in Central America, we have had a hand in some of what's going on there too. Doesn't make us entirely responsible by any means, but there is a bigger picture there than just things suck elsewhere, so now we have to deal with it. I'm sorry. Any questions on this in terms of who's coming and how that's changed? There's a lot more detail we could get into if we had more time, but I'm already running a little late, so I want to try to keep going if we can. All right. So one of the other things that I wanted to get to is what undocumented immigrants provide and receive from our society, because this is another issue where I think there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of misunderstandings about what does and does not happen. Part of that is because some of the things are actually not as intuitive as one might think. I was a little surprised on some of them. So here are the various taxes that undocumented immigrants do and do not pay. State sales tax, pretty much always, right? Anytime you go and buy something, you pay the sales tax. That you don't get to say, I'm undocumented, no sales tax for me. Like, they're going to charge it, you pay it. Excise tax, you buy a car, you buy something big, you're going to pay that unless you're purchasing things illegally, which is a whole other thing, and we don't really have any evidence to believe that happens more often among any particular communities. Property tax, which I had not thought about, generally speaking, undocumented immigrants pay indirectly. And the way this works is this. If I rent a room in a house, the price that I'm renting that room at is going to be set based on what the person who owns the house needs to charge in order to make money and pay their property tax. They are paying taxes on the property I am inhabiting. So in the same way that I am functionally paying property tax if I am a legal resident of the United States living in an apartment, the folks who are undocumented who live in houses or apartments are also contributing to property tax indirectly. That's one of those that does not seem too intuitive, but when you follow the money trail, actually does line up pretty strongly. No, generally speaking, capital gains tax are not things that undocumented immigrants pay because in most instances, they don't have lots of money with which to acquire stocks and capital and then sell them and make money off of it. So that is mostly an instance where it's not that in most cases they are choosing not to pay the taxes, it's more that they are not engaging in the activity that would often be taxed, though that's by no means universal. This thing, the ITIN, Individual Taxpayer ID Number, is actually insanely important to this entire debate, and I had no idea what it was until I started researching. Anyone familiar with this concept? So here's the deal. So you know when you fill out your taxes, you put your social security number and stuff on there, yeah? There are other ways to identify yourself. You can request and get an individual taxpayer ID number. And this is for people who do not have a social security number. If I'm a legal permanent resident of the United States, I don't have a social security number, but I still got to pay taxes, right? So I request and get an ITIN. In the same way, in applying for that, I do not have to verify my status here legally. I just request it. I say, I want to give you money, government. Give me a number so I can do it. And the government goes, OK, that seems cool. Here, have a number. Give us money. And then they do. So in some instances, people who file taxes using an ITIN will still pay some degree of capital gains tax if they have any that they claim on there, but that is one that is unlikely to be paid by undocumented immigrants. The maybe category is significant here. Income tax in particular. So this is one where we generally think of undocumented immigrants not contributing, right? Because if you're being paid under the table, below minimum wage, yeah, that is not going to happen mostly, right? If I get paid 20 bucks, then I should be getting paid more than that, and my employer isn't reporting that. Yeah, that probably won't, no tax will be applied there unless they're reporting it as being paid to somebody else, which often happens so they can avoid audits, in which case they will pay payroll taxes on that money. They will still withhold Medicare, Social Security taxes as well, because if they don't, the IRS comes after them for not explaining where their money went. So in some instances that will happen. In other instances, usually where it's smaller scale, people making far below minimum wage, in those cases they won't. But in those cases, those people are usually below the poverty line and below the threshold where you have to pay federal income tax at all. So the difference there is more limited. This was the number that really surprised me. Best estimates, and this is something that even the current administration, maybe not the top part of it, but Customs and Border Patrol and the IRS and Department of Homeland Security all come in on the same estimate that about 50% of the people with ITINs are undocumented immigrants. And the first question is, why the hell would you bother, right? If you're not here legally, why the hell are you paying taxes? There's actually a really good reason for it. And it's that almost all previous amnesty type bills, if you remember Ronald Reagan did the big amnesty thing back in the day, right? And part of the language that was included in there is when we grant amnesty to people, when we say that we're going to forgive the illegal crossing of the border and let you stay as a citizen, or stay as a permanent resident, one of the things that's included is looking for, quote, good moral character, end quote, and ways to demonstrate that. One way that most people in that instance pointed to is, look, I paid taxes. That shows I'm willing to contribute to the country, and that factored in a major way into a lot of people's claims under that bill. So based on that prior experience, there are people who are saying, I'm willing to hedge my bets. I think that there's a decent chance that I may have a chance for legalization eventually, and I want to be able to point to the fact that I'm trying to do the right thing. Like I said, the estimate we have is about 50% of people who requested that number and who use it and file taxes under it are undocumented. Surprised me, but interesting. Incidentally, there are like 3 slides at the end with all the footnotes and citations. There are like 30 of them. So feel free to go through them if you want. They'll be on the video, and I think the PowerPoint can get emailed out to anybody who wants it to. The other one, and this is the bigger one, payroll tax. So again, if you're paid off the books, no, but what will happen for a lot of people is they'll either get an ITIN, or in some cases, they'll basically steal a Social Security number. Which is itself potentially criminal, so that's an issue. But that aside, it means that they then can go through the employment verification thing, they get paid, and then they also pay taxes, because that Social Security number is expected to turn in tax returns, because the employer will say, I gave money to this person for work. If the IRS sees that and they don't see the tax return from that person, there's going to be trouble. So in any instances where someone is using a phony Social Security number or a stolen Social Security number, they are still, at the very least, having Social Security and payroll tax withheld. Because remember, a lot of that isn't about what you file later on. It gets withheld immediately, right? And then you maybe get it back later on. So questions on any of these areas? Yeah?
Where do migrant workers fall?
In those cases, they are usually documented. Well, it depends, because they can be either. They can either get the seasonal work visas, in which case they are documented and here legally, or they're people who aren't immigrants who stay here. They come here, they pick cotton or whatever, or pick bananas or whatever it is they pick downstairs, apples, strawberries, you name it. They come here, they pick crops, and then they go back home. In those instances, when they are being paid those wages, if they're being paid below minimum wage, so not being paid legally, then they probably are not, because the employer probably is not going to report that, because then the IRS will come in, or no, actually the FLSA, Federal Labor Standards Act, well, the people who enforce that are like, yeah, minimum wage is a thing. Pay it, or we'll fine you and stuff. So what will happen in those cases is one of 2 things. Either the employer tries to operate entirely off the books. They do not have an official company, or they have some sort of shell company they operate within. Or, more likely, the employer will say, yep, I hired 4 people, this guy, and this guy. And they actually hired 20 people. And those 4 people they can do legal taxes for, and they just divide up the money they say they paid to them to everybody else. But in that case, payroll, Social Security, et cetera, that's all getting withheld from those 4 people and functionally withheld from all the others. So it again becomes an instance where it's an indirect sort of thing, but if money is going from a company to a person, unless the entire company is underground and off the grid, the IRS wants to know what happened with it, which means there's a pretty good incentive unless you want to get audited. And when you're doing things that are shady, audits are super bad. Heck, when you're doing things that are right, audits are super bad. So trying to avoid those is a pretty high priority, and it's usually worth the small penalty of paying what are fairly low payroll taxes and whatnot. Does that speak to your question, sir?
I don't want to take,
Okay.
I'll just throw it out and you can answer.
Fair enough. if there's more in the end, let me know.
What I believe happened is, as wages became unattractive to American citizens, companies brought in migrant workers and sometimes illegals to do those jobs because they could pay them below. Has that become part of this system, meaning following up on those people who have, if you will, illegally brought people into this country, giving them below minimum wages, simply because they could do that? Have they been prosecuted? Or?
If we catch them, yes. And what will usually happen is when someone says, so I've got a strawberry field that's like 15 acres. I hired 4 people and they picked them all. The IRS is like, no. We're taking a look at what's going on. Then they're in huge trouble. So it's when those things don't match up that they run into trouble. So they try to skate as close as they can to figuring out a way to avoid it. We do catch people from time to time. When we do, they get fined pretty massively, not as much as they probably should. There's also a separate system called E-Verify, which is a whole different discussion, but it basically means that you have to, you have to fill out like the I-9 when you go to apply for a job. It's a few steps up from that where there's a whole database that keeps track of all of it. It's actually a pretty good system, but we've underfunded it to where it doesn't really work very well. And that would be, and also agricultural lobbies don't really want us to have it, so there's a lot of pushback in Congress to allocating more funding to it, even though it's an idea that would largely decrease that issue. The whole secondary thing that I'm going to sidestep today, because it's an entire discussion on its own, are the economic effects of increasing the wages we pay to people who pick produce to minimum wage, which would increase prices on a lot of stuff. But that's, again, separate discussion that I'm going to set aside. Go for it, sir.
I was in Walmart recently, and I had to go to so I was looking for something, and I had to go to one person. This person didn't speak any English, who referred to me to another person who barely spoke English. I assume these people are illegal.
Why?
What's that?
Why?
Well, because I'm thinking of working at Walmart, which is, I think it wouldn't be worth their while to hire people illegally.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you saying you're assuming that people are legal or illegal, or are here legally? And I guess my question would be, why would we assume that they are here illegally? There are a lot of folks, especially. Oh.
I'm saying here they're legally. But
oh, okay.
I'm curious.
I'm sorry.
What kind of visa they would be under?
Well, they may have been born here.
I don't think they were born here because
really?
They didn't speak any English.
Depending on where you live, that actually is not necessarily an issue.
I understand that,
but
they couldn't even, they couldn't even direct me because they directed me to somebody else who could barely speak English.
Fair enough. So either they were raised in a community where that English was not spoken, or they've come here from a country that primarily speaks something other than English. There, I would need to know a lot more about the person's circumstances to know. Family reunification is the most likely way they may have come here. It's unlikely that someone with an H-1B visa would be extended to a Walmart employee.
Yeah, it was just a lot of people that I came into contact with. And, they were very pleasant, and I wouldn't want anything to happen to them, but it just seemed,
Well,
what happened to teenagers who were looking for jobs and stuff like that? I know when I was in New York, and I was always looking for a job like that.
Yeah, I hear you. That is also a much longer discussion that sadly we do not have time to go into, which largely revolves around the fact that wages in the United States stagnated in the 1970s and functionally have not risen or kept pace with inflation since then, despite corporate profits being at the highest rate in history. That divergence is what has meant that those lower paying jobs are overcrowded then by people who are older and potentially have more or different experience, and they're not as accessible to entry-level people. Automation is also a part of crunching that part of the labor market. But whole separate thing that I'd love to talk to you about, but can't right now. Let's keep going. So these are the areas in which taxes are commonly paid. Second aspect are benefits. This is another area where there's some confusion about what is and is not available to people. So if you're an undocumented immigrant, again, if you're here legally, all of these things are fine. But if you're an undocumented immigrant, you have access to school, because we have decided if you're present here, you deserve to have an education, because that is in all of our benefits to happen. We've also decided that if you show up bleeding on the steps of the ER, the doctor can't say, I'm sorry, I don't know what country you're from, you can die. There is an obligation to provide emergency life-saving treatment. Nothing beyond that. but emergency life-saving treatment they will have access to. They'll get billed for it, and then collection agencies may hound them, but they have the right to receive that kind of treatment. They also get the same benefits that all of us get, access to police, fire, roads, all that kind of stuff. WIC is one of the only government programs they can access. This is basically a nutrition assistance program that is only available to women who are either pregnant or the mothers of young children. Because we seem to have decided that pregnant women shouldn't starve, which I guess makes some sense. And we've decided that that belief should extend to people regardless of legal status. So that is one of the only government programs, and it provides a fairly small amount of money, but it does provide some. And then some state assistance programs, this varies a lot state to state. Some states make more available, some make less available. New York and California both have more broad scale things there than some other states do. On the flip side, you do not get access to Medicare, even though a portion of your pay, if you're paying income tax like we talked about earlier, a portion of your pay is being deducted from Medicare and you will never claim it. Same for Social Security. The estimate, I've got this on a slide toward the end, but the estimate is that something like $11 billion is added to Social Security by undocumented immigrants. That's money that is put in that they will never claim every year. So they are actually helping to keep Social Security solvent, which I would not have guessed. Children's health insurance program, also CHIP or S-CHIP, or the various things, that's not accessible. Food stamps, unemployment insurance, Pell Grants, student loans. Some states allow in-state tuition for people who are either legal permanent residents or in some cases undocumented folks, so that's a state-by-state sort of decision. So just to lay out what some of the stuff on both sides are. What's that?
They don't cost us anything.
There are arguments like on the school end, bilingual education does have a cost associated with it, and that is more common in places where you have immigrants, documented or otherwise. WIC has a fairly small cost associated with it. It's smaller than food stamps by quite a bit, and food stamps is pretty small. So cost there is fairly minimal, but it does exist. And they do theoretically put stress, like police and fire have more houses to go to because there are more people who live in those houses. So there are a number of ways in which there is an effect. So I don't want to claim it doesn't exist. But most folks who have done the calculation here, and again, this is on one of the slides toward the very end, have found that on net, even undocumented immigrants end up contributing more to the government financially than they end up receiving from it. There are larger arguments about societal implications and whether that's good or bad, and that's a whole separate debate we could have if we had time. But on a pure numbers level, there is a lot of misinformation thrown around here. I would encourage you to read the direct sources. If you actually, even if you just look, undocumented immigrants, taxes, benefits, scan through the first 20 articles, and they'll all get you pretty much the same place. So, last bits, okay, so we got 10 minutes left technically. I'm going to stay here a little longer if people want. We got two major controversies I want to talk about. We'll go through as much as we can in the time we have. So, the two big things that I wanted to focus on are first, some restrictions on asylum, which the current administration has been pursuing and implementing. First, they tried to ban all asylum claims that are not made at a point of entry. So the way the law works right now is two ways you claim asylum. You either go to a port of entry and say, I want to claim asylum, or you set foot in the country and say, God's help me, I need asylum. And either way, international law and US law says you have the right to enter asylum proceedings at that point. Doesn't mean you automatically get it. It means you get to present your case to someone who adjudicates that and decides, do you have a credible fear of persecution? If you do, then we'll keep you as an asylum person, or keep you as an asylee, we'll allow you in. So the Trump administration tried to say that you can only apply at ports of entry, despite the fact the 1980 law said you can do otherwise. If you remember from earlier, the president can't make laws, so that was a problem. The court stopped that because it violated the law. Trump administration also, and this is a policy that was in effect until very, very recently, like 2 days ago, they tried to force all asylum seekers, if you wanted to apply in the US, you had to wait in Mexico. If you came into the US, they would not consider your application. They would treat you as an undocumented immigrant and immediately deport you regardless of an asylum claim because you didn't follow proper procedure. Problem is, federal judge ruled against that earlier this week, again, because Congress passed a law that says it doesn't work that way. And apparently the president can't make laws. Next, President Trump, this is something that is not codified in official policy, and it's just about 2 or 3 days old, so I don't know the level of credibility on it. The information I found suggests it is legitimate, but I want you to take it with a grain of salt and look into it yourselves to make sure. When he was visiting the border a few days ago, he told Customs and Border Patrol people that they should deny asylum seekers entry to the United States, and if they said they had a judge's order to do otherwise, he should say, sorry, still can't do it, country's full, you can't come in. That would violate both US law and both of the court decisions made earlier. It was not put into a formal memo or executive order, so it likely does not have the force of law, but it is still a command coming from the chief executive, and so it's unclear what the legal status would be. However, Customs and Border Patrol has told their agents it is illegal for them to do that, and if they do, they will be subject to lawsuit and possibly get fired. So it's probably not going to happen, but it's another instance where the pushback is being presented. The last issue, and this is something that has not gotten anywhere near as much attention as I think it probably should, because this is another one of those things that is administrative sort of changes rather than big flashy changes. Obstruction and what's called metering at ports of entry. This is where the Border Patrol folks will say, someone comes to a point of entry and says, I'm requesting asylum. And they go, okay, we've already accepted all the people we can today, come back tomorrow. And then you come back tomorrow and they say, okay, we've already accepted all the people we can for today, come back tomorrow. And then you come back tomorrow and they say, okay, we've already accepted all the people we can today, come back tomorrow. There is nothing in the 1980 law or international law that enables people to set a limit on the number of asylum seekers who can be processed or who can enter in any given year. Like, that is not something that they have the capacity to do. It violates the law. The ACLU is in the process of challenging this, as are several other groups. One of the other things that has happened here are folks physically blocking entry to the border. And this gets dicey because border is the front of the chairs here, right? So I'm on the US side, I'm on the Mexican side, I'm on the US side, I'm on the Mexican side, and then I'm doing the Charleston, and you folks might actually remember some of what that means. So I'm over here, and if I'm a Border Patrol person, hooray. If someone tries to cross, as soon as they put a foot on this side, they've got an asylum claim. And if I push them back out, I've engaged in illegal deportation, and that gets nuts. But if I stand here to block them, now I'm on Mexican soil and I've technically invaded the country of Mexico, which also creates a slight problem. So it's an instance where they have tried to physically block people from coming or disperse people. These are things that are not organized on a large scale level from what we can tell. It's more individual or small level initiatives that are being taken. But evidence suggests that Customs and Border Patrol is not stopping people from obstructing. And that's sort of the secondary way in which, even if these policy changes are stopped, the metering thing, it's not a denial of asylum, but it functionally is. And that becomes a problem that doesn't get as much attention, but may make a much larger effect overall on what happens. So that's kind of where things are at in terms of asylum stuff. Let's talk family separation, because this is another one that may be coming back, which is interesting. So first, background on this one. I expect you all may have heard a fair amount, but I want to make sure we got the timeline and the details right. So one place where there's been a lot of misinformation on this policy is what the difference between this policy is and previous administration's policies, and why are they different, and why are things the way they are. So in terms of background, previous administrations did at times separate children from their parents. And there was a specific instance and specific ways in which that could happen. It was very much the exception, not the rule, but it did sometimes happen. It would happen only if the parent was being tried for either a violent crime or a felony of some kind, which means we need to if it's a violent crime, then we're not going to let them out on parole while they wait their trial. We have to hold them in jail, which means we can't hold the kid in jail, which means we have to separate them. So violent crime, or if we believe the individual claiming to be a parent is not actually a parent of the kid, but is actually a human trafficker. Like, yes, I have these 17 teenage daughters who are all mine, who I am bringing to the United States, absolutely not to sell into slavery. Yeah, we're going to separate them. So that kind of thing would happen, but those would be the instances in which it happened, and it was very much the exception. That was the other issue here is when you cross the border illegally, it is a crime. You have violated the law, and it is a criminal issue. We generally do not prosecute people for that, largely because the penalty is pretty small. It's about 90 days in jail at most at a $10 fine. Most people wait more than 3 months for their trial. So prosecuting them makes no sense. They are sentenced to time served and a $10 fine, and we have incurred all the court costs and had to house them during that time and a bunch of other stuff. So in the past, the only time we would prosecute people for that was when it was something we tacked on to a bunch of other significant serious charges as well, which meant the only times when we were separating kids from their parents, because we had to put the parents in jail for that kind of a trial, was when the parent was being tried for a violent or serious crime. So that kind of prosecution was, again, not the rule, it was the exception. We usually just deported those folks. Again, remember at the very beginning, criminal, civil, administrative, deportation, administrative court, or immigration court, not criminal court, which means they don't have to be held or housed in the same way, that kind of thing. Undocumented immigrants, like we said, generally only prosecuted if there's another crime involved. One thing you need to know about is what's called the Flores settlement. This gets referenced a lot. It happened in 1997 under Clinton. This came when, if you remember the chart on border immigration, there was a huge influx under Clinton in the 90s, and they tried a bunch of different things to try to deal with it, some better than others. But there were instances where they were holding migrant kids, and the court and people sued them over it and said, you can't put kids in jail without convicting them of something. And even then, not jail, like juvie. And the settlement the government reached was, all right, well, here's what we're going to do. Two things. We will not hold any minor longer than 20 days, and we will always hold them in the least restrictive environment possible. So that means if we can put them in a daycare center with a lock on the door, we will do that instead of putting them in solitary confinement in a supermax prison. With me? The government is obligated under the Flores settlement to not hold kids more than 20 days and to hold them in the least restrictive environment it possibly can. And since jail is almost always more restrictive than what you would do for a kid, if the parent has to go to jail, you've got to separate the two because of Flores. So here's where we end up from there. Oh yeah, actually, I just said that, sorry. Yeah, parents charged, kept in jail waiting for trial, kid can't be kept there, so you got to separate. So that's the way that things had been. Two big things changed. First, spring and summer of 2017, this is also something that has not gotten a ton of attention. In the spring and summer, we don't actually know the specific date because there have been no public policy memos released on it. A zero tolerance program began in a couple different places. The zero tolerance program, you'll hear a bunch. This is where the Attorney General said anybody who crosses the border, regardless of any other circumstances, will be tried in criminal court. We have zero tolerance for border crossing. So that said, by default, everybody goes into the criminal justice system. Remember back here? That is what caused this entire thing to happen. Because as soon as everyone goes in the criminal justice system, the parent's always there, and that means can't keep the kid there too. But spring and summer of 2017, zero tolerance policy is announced, or not announced actually, but is implemented in, I think it's in, not in Amarillo, I had the name, it was another city in Texas, El Paso. It was in El Paso and a few other places. They started doing it to people who came into those locations or were processed through those locations. All the individuals were apprehended, criminally charged. Nearly all convictions resulted in time served and a $10 fine. Yeah?
Okay, if I'm understanding you, there is a law saying that illegal immigrants are violating it's a civil.
There's a criminal law. If you cross the border improperly, you have violated a criminal law, the penalty for which is up to 90 days in jail and a $10 fine. There is a separate administrative thing that says you have messed up, you have not done the immigration process correctly, and the penalty for that is deportation. So the Jeff Sessions version here was hitting them with both of those things. Usually we only hit them with the second one because that's the one that really matters and has a significant effect. Does that answer where you were going there, or am I missing it?
So is Jeff Sessions allowed to do that?
Yep. I mean, largely yes. Like the Attorney General gets to decide how the Department of Justice will tell its prosecutors to do stuff. So prosecutors have what's called prosecutorial discretion. They can decide in any given case, are we going to prosecute here or are we not? And there are other factors that affect that, but there are a lot of times when DAs decline to prosecute, either because they don't think they can win it, or they think that what they would win out of that isn't worth the investment of resources, and it means they won't be able to deal with more important crimes that happen. So prosecutors have discretion, but when they get an order from the top, that discretion changes. So Jeff Sessions gave the order that in all instances, do not exercise discretion, always prosecute. And then they needed to do that. So part of what's relevant here is there was no public announcement of this policy in the spring and summer of 2017. Remember, this happened in a couple areas, not across the border in general. That went on for close to a year. We do not know how many children were separated during that time. Records were not kept. There was no process for reunification for those kids with their parents.
And the media was not covering it.
There were a few stories, but it was not a big deal yet, no. partially because media folks were not allowed into those areas. The only way that it was known that it was happening, because it was an internal directive that came down, not a big announcement. So the only way we actually knew it was happening at all is groups that represent undocumented immigrants in court were like, why do we suddenly have a ton more people in these like 3 or 4 areas that need our help? And they figured out this was the deal. So a few people reported on it, but it didn't get national attention yet. That went on for quite a while. Housing and Human Services, which is one of the government departments that helps with the housing of migrant kids, they estimate that thousands, they can't give anything more specific than that, of kids were separated during this time. We do not know how many, we do not know who, we do not know where. There was no requirement that records be kept. And in a lot of ways, part of what's odd, at least to me, is I actually think this personally is more horrifying than the part that got all the attention that happened afterwards, though there are problems in both cases, arguably. This was sort of a pilot program, basically. They wanted to see how it would work out. They had some evidence that it may decrease border crossings, but when you correct for year-to-year changes, there was no change in any significant way. So fast forward to a year later. In April 2018, Sessions officially announced a zero-tolerance policy for the entirety of the southern border. No, not the northern border, just the southern border. So if you come into the United States and cross the border illegally, you will be prosecuted, no exceptions. That rolls the policy out on a larger level. During that time, approximately 2,700 kids were separated from their parents. Policy ended up getting rolled back after a couple months. Theoretically, there would have been more over a longer time period. Facilities were overwhelmed. Like, we have some facilities for this, because remember, occasionally this did happen under previous administrations, but those were, again, designed to deal with the exception where we have a violent criminal or we have someone who's exploiting kids that we need to separate, not everybody, especially not asylum seekers who are bringing their kids, who are already fleeing violence and persecution, which arguably puts them in a more vulnerable state. So the facilities that we had available for kids were way inadequate for the numbers that came in, because this policy wasn't something that was announced and then ramped up to. It was announced and immediately implemented. So we didn't build additional facilities ahead of time. We just had to repurpose what we had. A lot of it was actually leased out to private companies, to private contractors. Some of the companies that do private prisons, the Geo Group, CSC, a number of different, those corporations have also created detention centers for these kids. So in particular, the record keep, actually, I'm sorry, let me rewind for one sec here. So if you heard about the whole baby cages thing, that's a bit of an exaggeration. So to be fair, what usually happened, and this varied a lot because there was no standard because it wasn't prepared ahead of time. It was kind of implemented on the fly with whatever we could pull together then. But they converted Walmarts or other large scale areas and put chain link fencing around kids and gave them like sleeping bags and thermal blankets and stuff. It didn't look good. From a PR perspective, this went very poorly. Only about 20% of Americans supported it. On the other hand, 20% of Americans supported it. The White House ended up rolling back the policy, but part of what's also notable here is in the past, the facilities we had for kids were either for the few instances where they were separated out of necessity or for unaccompanied minors, kids who were older who came here on their own. And there was a big influx of those at one point under the Obama administration. Those kids are usually like 14, 16, 18 or so. So the facilities for those are not the same as the facilities you need for a 2-year-old. And we were separating younger kids from their parents. And the other issue here is the record keeping at DHS was really poor. And this is an instance, I mean, there are kind of two aspects of this policy. There is the policy decision, which is whether it is a good idea to separate kids from their parents while we try them in court. We can have arguments on whether that is good or bad. There is a second level of the policy, which is if you are going to do that, how should you implement it? And what responsibilities does the government have? If it takes a kid away, does it have any responsibility for making sure that kid can be returned to their parent? Or is this functionally kidnapping? Arguably, probably not. But either way, because they did not keep records at DHS, there are a lot of kids that we had a lot of difficulty reuniting. There were a number of instances where we deported the parents while the kids were still here. And now we have lost track of the parents. We don't know who they are, and we cannot get the kid back to them. There are about 100 kids now that we still have not reunited. And the burden for doing that has largely fallen to private organizations. Actually, the ACLU is one of them, but there are other organizations that are going to Nicaragua and other places and trying to find the parents who were deported to try to get their kids back to them. There was initially, like I said, no plan for reunification. The courts eventually said you have to, like, if we can't say we can't, or we're not going to ban you from taking the kids away, but we will say you must return them to their parents. You do like, the penalty for crossing the border is not deprivation of child, right? That is not what is written in the law, and thus you can't enforce that as if it is a penalty. Did I get my dates right on here? I don't think I missed anything, but. Yeah, there was about a year there where it was in the pilot program stage and happened a few places with fairly significant intensity. So, what else did I have? Oh, yeah. Oh, nope, yep, there was one more. So, that goes on for a while, and after a few months, Trump signs an executive order under significant political pressure to end the process, kind of. This is where it gets kind of weird. Well, this is one of the places it continues to get kind of weird. The order has contradictory instructions. Because it says two things at the same time. It says our zero tolerance policy is still in effect. We are still going to prosecute everybody who crosses the border. But we will not separate kids from their families. But we will also do what the Flores decision says, which means that we can't hold them for more than 20 days and we can't hold them in jail with adults. We will do all of those things, which is not physically possible. So it also instructs the DOJ. This is another thing that I don't think has gotten as much attention as maybe it should. It instructed the Department of Justice to try to overturn the Flores decision to allow for indefinite detention of children without charge. That has not yet panned out. My guess is folks in the Justice Department are either slow walking that, or they know that's going to be a very, very difficult case to make, or they've made no progress in doing it. But so far, nothing has shifted on that ground. But Trump has officially instructed them to remove that to allow for indefinite detention. Customs and Border Patrol, dealing with this contradictory set of instructions, has decided to stop enforcing the zero tolerance policy because it was the only way for them to resolve the legal imperatives they were given. So they are not referring everyone for prosecution. However, there are a few caveats. This is something that's just been coming out in the last few months. Separations have started ticking up again over the last few months to levels that are not at where they were when the zero tolerance policy was there, but are significantly above where they were under previous precedents. So we don't know the details here. That's supposed to say since, not 250 kids sin in February. I'm sure maybe they do, depending on which religion you're part of, but that's what I meant. Sorry, forgive the typo. So we've got about another 250 kids, as best we can tell, that have been separated from their parents. And in a number of instances, these are kids who have been referred to ORR, which is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is one of the groups of people who is in charge of finding homes for these kids. And a lot of times ORR asks, okay, so where's the parent? What happened? And there are instances that, again, the article here, go ahead and read it. I'll show you the text at the end. And again, check the PowerPoint of the video. There will be more if you start looking for them. But the argument that's happening in a lot of cases is there are parts of the border in certain offices that are still choosing to default to prosecuting without any special justification, and most other parts are not. So the policy of separation is basically still in place in a piecemeal sort of way, and that's part of what's going on. We don't know the details because no formal announcement has really been made. There are one or two other things that are relevant here. This one just happened. Kirsten Nielsen, she was in a lot of ways the face of the child separation thing because she was head of the department when it happened, and she defended it, which is her job. But she was just forced to resign a few days ago. Scuttlebutt, and again, gods only know how accurate it is, though the confirmation from multiple sources is pretty strong, suggests that for months the Trump administration was trying to reinstate separation of children, and being the one who had to be on point defending it and stand in front of Congress and defend it and repeatedly explain to the news why it is okay, she said, no, that is a bad idea. Do not do that. Please do not do that. No, really, I'm not going to do that. And then the Trump administration has decided, okay, she's not going to do that. We're going to get somebody else. Whether that other person will do it or whether they still want to do it is unknown. But that is one thing and that's one of the reasons I selected this as one of the two controversies to look at, is I think that there is a decent chance that this issue will come up again. Maybe they may handle it better from a PR perspective, but I expect the underlying policy might be reinstated. Part of the other argument here is the argument that gets made, that a number of folks in the administration have made, and this is an argument that's worth discussing, is the threat of taking someone's kids away from them is a deterrent. If people know their kids might be taken away, they might not come here. So it's not our fault that we're taking them away, it's their fault that they chose to come. That's the argument that Jeff Sessions made. It's the argument that John Kelly, who was the former chief of staff and actually the former head of Department of Homeland Security and her boss before he got moved up, that's the argument he made. It's a deterrent, that if you threaten someone with something bad enough, they won't do the thing you don't want them to do. The argument on the other end is that taking someone's kids away is not a humane thing to threaten them with, especially if they are fleeing to the United States to keep their kids from being killed by gangs there. So that's a debate that is worth having, but that's sort of the subtext here. This is not a decision that is being made because it has a benefit within the immigration system. It is largely being made to try to deter illegal immigration, which, again, debatable, but that's the rationale that's been articulated. Finally, and this just happened as well, Ron Vitiello, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. Vitiello probably. He was the acting director of ICE. There are a large number of people who are in acting capacities and not confirmed capacities, largely because people at the top of a lot of administrations have either chosen to resign or been forced out. And when you put an acting director in, they do not need to be confirmed by the Senate. So they were able to do all the same things without having to answer any questions before the Senate, disclose tax or financial information, or account for any past decisions. Basically, there is a concern that the Senate's ability to confirm nominees is being circumvented, but it's one of these things that is a norm. Historically, no president has ever wanted to keep an acting director in place. They've always tried to get a permanent person in there because that provides more continuity to the department. The department itself will work more efficiently and better, and because that's the way things are supposed to go. That norm is not codified in law anywhere, and so it's not being implemented now. Yeah?
Is there a limit to the length of time an acting can be in?
Not in most positions. There are a few where there are. There are a few. Defense secretary is one where we set a limit on the acting position under certain circumstances. There are others where there is no official limit. So it depends on the position. But him being withdrawn, here again, this is speculation on my part, so grains of salt, take it as you will. His reputation was he was a career law enforcement official. He was not a political person who did this as well. This was his career. And he was generally seen as moderate to conservative. So his approach was, I'm trying to word this in the most neutral way that I am able. You don't generally work in immigrations and customs enforcement, the deportation wing of the federal government, unless you agree with deportation of decent numbers of people. So he didn't have a problem with deportation, but he certainly didn't want to take it as far as some in the Trump administration have wanted. The only rationale that Trump has given, or his government has given, for the decision to withdraw Vitiello's nomination is he wanted someone tougher. We don't know exactly what that means or who he would conceivably find to fill that position. So it is now passed down to the acting deputy assistant director of ICE, who's I think 3 steps below Senate confirmation, has been temporarily elevated to the position. And honestly, I have not yet had time to research him, so I have no idea what he's going to do. But that's sort of where we are there. Overall, future policy is pretty uncertain. A lot of the question is what the administration will continue to do, what the courts will allow them to do, and when and if Congress will assert any oversight ability, especially because of the divided Congress and the fact that you need 60 votes in the Senate because of the perpetual filibuster, which is another norm that has been obliterated by both sides. It means it is very unlikely Congress will pass any compromise on immigration, especially because anything that would get Trump's signature could not actually be a compromise that most folks in the Democratic Party would be happy with, which means you would never get enough to do it. So these issues are unlikely to improve anywhere except the courts, or at least unlikely to change meaningfully anywhere except the courts in the next few years. There are separate issues in terms of how the courts are being filled in terms of appointments that may make changes there less likely. The last thing I wanted to get to, Doug, to answer the question you asked at the very beginning in terms of what things we might do that could solve some of these problems, or at least make some things better.
We're not gonna have to auto supper, are we?
What's that?
We're not gonna have to auto supper, are we?
Oh, good Lord, I'm 15 minutes over. I'm sorry. I hope not, because I'm supposed to be home for that. Yeah.
I'll withdraw the question.
Y'all are free to go without feeling rude, but I can answer this in just a quick minute. Here's the quick answer. There are a few non-controversial things which could be done immediately to make a big difference. First, hire more immigration judges. Right now we have about 400 of them, and they need to process thousands of people. And there are not enough people, and that means we have massive backlogs. Those backlogs mean we have to hold people, we are choosing to hold those people, which means our facilities are overcrowded, which causes a ton of other problems. So hire a lot more immigration judges. That would do a lot more to help with the issues of the border than would a bunch more border guards, because generally we're doing a decent job with apprehension. Second is bring the folks who adjudicate asylum claims down to the border to do it. So that can be done on site. There's a proposal right now that the administration is considering that would, instead of having the folks who are legally charged with adjudicating asylum stuff, they're people with legal and refugee and psychological experience, instead of having them do it, they were suggesting having border guards do it, who do not have any training to do that. And doing that would greatly decrease the number of people who are accepted for asylum. So I would suggest not doing that, but instead taking the people who are trained to do it and putting them there instead of having to shuffle people. Small logistical change, but makes a decent sized difference. Yeah?
Is there any processing being done in Mexico?
Not much. You can, if you're applying for,
I think that
yeah.
applying, that way you'd be coming legally.
Yep.
And if we could set up something in Mexico
Yeah.
to assist people.
Yeah, and that's where if you're doing any of the legal application routes, or if you're applying as a refugee, you can absolutely do that from another country. The problem is, for the refugee thing, the wait period is probably going to be 5+ years. Whereas asylum, you step in the country and you make your claim. So that's the other issue. We need to put more money and more people into dealing with immigration, not more people to process the paperwork. If we're going to increase the amount of paperwork we require, we then need more people to process that paperwork. We can't do one without the other and expect the system to run it all smoothly. And that's kind of where we are now, because we have increased those requirements. What was that?
It was also excessively expensive.
Yep, several thousand minimum just to file your application. Yeah. So that's sort of where we are. The last thing that I think would be a fairly easy solution is raising the cap tremendously and lifting the by-country thing. Is I think that, and again, this is my personal opinion, so not objective fact by any means, but I think that there are, well, two other things. Sorry, I will shut up eventually, I promise. And again, you can leave without feeling rude. But I think that as long as where people are, things are so bad and they are so terrified that they are willing to walk or move thousands of miles on a very dangerous trip to try to get here, whatever we threaten them with here is not going to deter that. So we either need to help make conditions better there. Incidentally, we have also just cut all aid to Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua as a penalty for them sending migrants, or for them permitting people to exit their country and come here, which is arguably very counterproductive, because the worse those countries get, the greater the impetus is to leave, the more control the gangs and cartels and criminals have. So the more giving foreign aid is usually seen as a charitable sort of thing, and there are definitely reasons to view it in that light, and there are moral reasons why it may be good. But from a purely practical perspective, in terms of making our lives here better, oftentimes money that is spent improving the economic, social, political, and safety conditions of another country, especially if that other country's people are fleeing to come here, that money will pay much larger dividends for us by decreasing the burdens that we have if we do it there, instead of trying to process all of it when it shows up here. So I don't think you will ever stop it entirely, and especially because most of the stuff I've got a whole thing on drugs and crime that we didn't get to, but wall doesn't help there. There and then there. Go ahead. Thank you.
Do you have any idea if the money that we had been giving them was being used in a useful manner?
It was doing some economic development. Like there were, and this is the problem with a lot of countries that are in really bad shape. Corrupt governments steal a good chunk of that. So like the return, probably about half of what we were sending was actually getting through to anybody, but that's still more than they had before. And there are solutions to that problem as well. In particular, this assumes it's government-to-government assistance, which is where our government gives the Nicaraguan government a bunch of money, right? There are a lot of other ways to do it. For example, government to NGO assistance. We give Doctors Without Borders a bunch of money to execute a program in Nicaragua. Those sorts of things actually tend to work really well. And if you are the government of a country, you generally want your people to not be miserable, because people are much more likely to revolt and overthrow you if they don't have democracy and can't elect things, if they think their life sucks. If you got nothing to lose, why not fight? So those sorts of things, and more funding to indirect NGOs, and then more funding to build up civil society, to train judges, lawyers, police. Like those are things that we've done other places that have worked out actually fairly well. The U.S. Agency for International Development has actually done some real good work in a few different countries in Africa on that issue. South Africa made some fairly progressive changes with U.S. support on those issues exactly. So the solution to everything is not throw more money there by any means, but it is one of the issues here. The other thing that I'd note is we have the paperwork requirement increase. I'm sorry, I'm still talking. I said I was going to shut up. But the paperwork increase, if you want to apply for status as a refugee or a legal permanent resident, before we had required you to provide 5 years of travel history, which is actually one of the hardest things to do, because you need to be able to say, I went here, these are the different places I have been out of my country, and even here's where I've lived in my country. And if you're fleeing a war under bombed out building number 16 for 2 days is not really what we want to get. But, So that was what we had required. That requirement has just been doubled internally to 10 years of history, which is very difficult, and it's paired with a second thing, which is if there are any errors on there, that is considered perjury, and that will prevent you from applying for legal status. And if you are doing it from the United States, and you're applying for citizenship, or you're applying to get your visa status changed, it will lead to deportation. So it's another example of an administrative change that has flown below the radar that has a very strong practical implication, but isn't really high and flashy. It is also another one of Stephen Miller's initiatives. I may disagree with his objective, but he is fairly effective at a number of his tactics to achieve it. So, hope that's been useful, even if it was long. If you want to ask other questions, feel free to come on up and chat with me. But I hope you had a good time and learned stuff.